Terem. Terem. Hey Marsh, thanks for joining us. Really excited to chat to you today. So Marsh is a API product manager at Google, also represents Google to the Open API specification, so has a nice broad view as well around APIs. Marsh, you've been a product manager in the API space for quite a while now. Really keen to chat to you about, well, APIs in general, and then get a bit deep on what you think is what like people need to be paying attention to at the moment in APIs. So let me I want to kick off the conversation and say, what, like, if you take APIs for our conversation here, we take APIs as given, people go, yep, I know I need an API, here's why. What is really interesting to me is that then how do we then communicate around those APIs? How do we let people know about them? How do we document them? Starts to become really important around enablement, usage, everything like that. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on where organizations need to be focusing with their APIs today.
Great, thanks, Scott. It's great to be here today too. The first thing I'd say is that what we've seen happen over the last decade and longer is this emergence of thinking of APIs as products. And this is exemplified by some like pure play businesses like Stripe or Twilio. They really set out to deliver their services entirely as an API. And a lot of our customers are established businesses trying to understand, how do you adapt to this world? How do you think in terms of this the consumer needs that you could meet, and how you would productize that so you can take all of the investment you've built to run your own business and leverage that beyond your own internal network. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think a lot of organizations are starting to get that on the external, putting our services up for consumption by others, but then often that same kind of rigor and thinking isn't applied to internal APIs. What do you think about it?
You've undersold it. I mean, it's so totally true. You're right. How do you? So it's interesting. It's changed how we think about how I think about this has changed a lot over the last decade. Even like in 2010 era, people were looking to examples from Facebook or Twitter, sort of these large digital natives who had managed to expose an API so that people could build on top of their service. And so that's that's certainly one thing, thinking about what are the external consumer needs. But internally, there are a whole bunch of things that are different. And while we used to say it's probably good practice to have a single developer portal that would meet both internal and external use cases, it turns out there are a lot of nuances to those APIs that have caused me to at least to rethink that. And now, actually, what I would recommend is to actually be more mindful about those differences. And I think it'd be fun to talk about that for a bit, if you don't mind.
This is a big shift. Everyone that's been building for internal, external on the same platform is now, we've thrown them into disarray. So
that's right. It's totally true. Because there are a few things that are really interesting. One is that typically you'll see 10 or 15 or even more times the number of internal APIs as the ones that are external.
Yeah.
And why is that? And part of that's because you're more likely to think in terms of how you architect your services. Microservices has been a big trend. How do you two pizza teams deliver this functionality? But how you choose to build and architect your own services internally, what's different there? You can afford, anytime you choose to refactor or break an API, internally you bear that cost yourself, right? The cost to implement it and the cost to consume it, those are just the cost of doing business. So if it makes sense for you to re-architect, you do. And what that means is that there's much higher churn, and the API contracts that might be described in an open API spec have a shorter time to live. Externally, the exact opposite happens. Like, you want to abstract how you've chosen to architect your services so that people just think in terms of the API contract that is presented to them. That contract is expected to be stable, because when an API provider makes changes and all their external consumers have to adapt to those changes, that's expensive. People haven't budgeted for that kind of thing. And so you tend to have more investment in API design so that you have you can use cognitive leverage to your advantage. If how one API works from a provider, you know how the other one does, and that longer time to live, and less visibility into how that is built, what team actually is on the engineering side behind it. Internally, that's a feature of an internal developer portal. You can know who to reach out to, and you'll send them an email or pick up the phone. Externally, you'd probably, so that your ability to ship new features would slow to a crawl if you had your engineers have direct contact with consumers from the outside world.
Now, to kind of play devil's advocate for a second,
So,
I've seen, you got tons of engineering teams updating APIs, almost a bit too on the agile extreme, or it's getting a bit chaotic and they're changing things all the time. And basically, people just come to disregard the specifications and they don't even bother. Like, I assume you're not advocating for that kind of
not
world.
at all.
Yeah, is it somewhere in the middle? What's the like? Because and then just to like when you start getting people to think about their specs and their APIs, even if it is internal, in a way that it could become external at some point,
Mhm.
then there's a bit of a mindset shift of
Yeah,
how do I make it usable? And it's the same at low level coding when you're writing a component. I used to be a C++ engineer. The nicer you make the component for someone to consume, the easier it is. And of course, you've got to balance that with like stuff changes while you're evolving your product. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. That where on the
yeah,
spectrum is it? Are you advocating for allow the chaos or
yeah. So it's at every organization is going to find the right balance that works for them. So that's the one thing I know is that everyone is a little bit different in their development culture. But there are some patterns that start to emerge. So one is simply the return on investment. There are oftentimes you may make an API that you're only ever intending to consume yourself, right?
yeah,
It may be because you're crossing a technology boundary, like you've got a backend service written in, let's say Java. You've got an app that's consuming that's written in Objective C, say, right? And so you're going to have an API so that you can talk between those two things. Um, and the if it's never expected to be used outside your team, it may not be worth the investment in documentation so that more teams can use it until you're ready for that. But for services that are meant to be shared, what you want to do is to be able to get out of the manual onboarding situation where you have to pass knowledge like a candle flame from one person to another, right? You want to be able to enable that self-service and have a spec that matches the implementation and it doesn't drift from what you say it is um, as time goes on. So it's just figuring out the return on investment for doing that documentation, just like any other project.
and this is like I kind of like where you're going with it because it enables if you've got that internal and then the external. I know if you start talking to anyone, engineers, executives, marketing team, whatever, about product managers, about this is going to go out to our customers. That fear of releasing early, like the definition of MVP or version one suddenly goes through the charts.
Yep.
Whereas if it's like, oh no, we're just going to release internally, we'll use it ourselves for a little while, and if we're all okay with it, then we'll promote it to the next step. Suddenly removes a lot of that stress factor, right? Like we're going to
Yeah.
do it here, and then we'll promote it. If
Yep.
it survives, I mean, it can also allow for that maturing through
It's
iteration
great.
of like, no, it turns out that API was useless. We're not going to promote it. This other one was better. That was trying to do the same thing. Yeah.
I mean, another interesting thing about this is to think about, software life cycles and how they're different when you're dealing with the API versus the UI. So there's a reason why A/B testing makes sense in UI land and why it makes a whole lot less sense in API land, right? Because A/B testing, I mean, it's like when you go to the eye doctor and they're A or B, and you say A, and then they switch the lenses up, A or B. That's understanding the human response to these two options. And you can do that at scale and have those kinds of experiments on a UI to understand how you can better meet user needs. But in an API, the cost is so high because you have to actually integrate that into your code. And so when you go to change the contract underneath, you're going to break things. And so you really have to be more mindful and upfront about the design process that you go through. And so what I've seen work fairly well is that, um, and even teams that I work on, design the API to meet the experience you're trying to deliver. Once you're certain that you've delivered that in production, then consider opening up the API. But the last thing you want is to discover that you got the API design wrong because you didn't understand the user journeys you needed to meet. And so I think it's not a bad practice, in fact, to launch your UI that depends on an API. And only once you've validated that the UI does what it needs, do you then invite people to start using the API. So I'd even consider decoupling your what you call beta of your UI versus beta from your API.
How do you think about doing that? Where, I mean, in your world, you're shipping APIs where you don't often have a UI to
Hmm.
do. So when you're thinking about API design, how do you do that if you don't have an API, or it's so far removed, as in maybe it's your customer or your consumer's API, and you can't
Hmm.
do that. You've got to build the API almost in
So
isolation.
yeah, but this is a really interesting piece. Like, if you don't have some real world use cases in mind when you're building an API, you're probably going to get the design wrong. You'll
Yeah.
find out later where you got it wrong. And so it's really important, and why I'm such a strong believer in this sort of design first approach to APIs, where you begin with an API specification, you sketch out what the interface is going to do, understand what is the functionality you would need to expose and how you would do that, and then socialize that with who your customers are going to be before you've written a line of code. Like, that's the best, most efficient way to arrive at the, at least make the least number of mistakes, the least expensive mistakes you can on your way to having an API.
So does your team, when you're building, you're in this meta land of building APIs that will become API, like people will build APIs on. do, do you do you take the spec and do you like design a lot of different concepts on the spec and then take like an API spec and then take it out, and do you have some kind of limit on the number of customers you'll go talk to? Yeah, you're like,
Ah,
hey,
okay,
we're
interesting.
not going to ship an API until we've spoken to 10 customers
Ah,
about the spec, or
that's funny. I think, if you think about this in terms of the internal needs, like, so many of these external APIs are repackaged internal services that abstract away how they're implemented. And so, internally, I think you mentioned this earlier when you were saying, is if you're thinking from the beginning about the possibility that these services might get externalized at some point, that's a signal that you should be focused on, thinking through the API design a bit, that you don't want to um, pick words that are not going to be obvious to people outside if they don't have the internal context.
yeah,
Um, so, I think internally, uh, even if you're building an API just for your team, it's nice to have an external perspective from someone else. So I find that having a a, a set of reviewers who are well versed, and this is where the concept of API design standards starts to become really interesting.
hmm
Um, and I think what Google's been doing with AIP.dev is super exciting. So, Google's been wrestling with this for 20 years. How do you, how do you have thousands of engineers building APIs that are somewhat similar?
yeah,
And
yeah,
so, this is standardization. How do you decide what the rules are that will define your style of API design? And then how do you put the sort of automated checks in place so that you can have these automated design reviews? And then Google has one other interesting concept that I think is neat, which is borrowed from code. So, there's several approved languages for production grade services at Google, and there's a concept of what's called readability. And so there are people who are sort of certified, internally certified for readability in Java or Go, and those are, people who should be doing code reviews along the way. And it's no different with APIs. Where APIs are just, an interface abstraction. They still have their own design patterns, and they're very much in computer science land. So they're not languages, but they're somewhat like languages. And so Google has this concept of API readability, and you can get trained their internal classes, and you can get certified as having API readability. And now you're in a position to review API designs. And this is one way. You see this in other organizations with like centers of enablement, who are responsible for trying to herd the cats in the right direction, um, set up the right behaviors and processes and guidelines. And it's always this combination of carrot much more than stick wherever you can, and trying to set up the incentives that drive the right behaviors. This is the sort of soft G governance.
And how do you balance this? We're talking about taking a design and taking it, socializing it with some potential users around a use case. How do you balance that, which is very much like we could do one now, we're just going to write one up, and ideally we're not going to open any specs because that's going to like reduce our creativity and reduce our ability to solve the customer problem. We want to ignore all that stuff for a moment. We're going to write that up. So you and I are going to like draft one now about, we had one of like a reminder that tells us to turn off our phones via API. So we're going to write that spec up, and we're going to take that out. We're going to start talking to people. How do you balance that level of like
Mm.
thinking that I think is focused on the customer? It's that outside
Yeah.
in, solve the problem, move
Yeah.
fast. How do you balance that with all the things you've just been saying around
Yeah.
adherence? Adherence is the wrong word, but that's how it always ends up. Is like adherence to
Yep.
the specification that's got the big approval before you can ship anything. How do you balance that?
Yeah, it's tough, and I think it's it's something that you share just with software in general. So let's see, there are a few things. First, I would say because you're starting to sound like a product manager for a second there. Take a moment and really understand the business case. Like, what is the problem? What's the user problem? Because if you're not grounded in that, and that again goes back to like understand if you're building an API, who your consumers are of that API and what their use cases are. So really, to spend the time, yeah, I like the way you put it before you dive into the spec, which is going to reduce the sort of, it's going to cause you to figure out how to conform and shape this actual implementation. Like, what are the problems? So write a one pager. Understand, like, I mean, when we model the API lifecycle in our own tooling, it's there's a design stage, but it's actually got some sub stages in it. Like the first step is like a concept, like that's like a one pager. What is the purpose for this API? Why should it exist? Why should your team build it? What are your alternatives? Because that's always a good place to begin. And once you've driven consensus that yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense, we should be investing in this. That's the point at which to then start sketching out what would the interface look like, what are the problems that each operation is going to address, and what are the words you will choose to design and build this API. And then, that's when I think having that API specification enables you to stand up a mock. There are lots of popular tools that can you can run a mock from that OpenAPI description, um, and that will enable you to engage with your possible customers um, when it's still cheap and easy to change the design at that stage of
Yeah,
assembly.
yeah. See, before you're not writing any real code. Nothing's touching a production system. You've had a bunch of conversations that are super cheap, like writing a document, really cheap. You could write hundreds of them a week in theory and throw those
Yeah,
ideas out there.
it's cheap, but it's amazing how rarely people do those things, right? Get out and talk to your customers is always going to help you avoid giant mistakes.
And I think something I'd kind of add to that as well, especially in API land, is there's sometimes your customer and then there's the developers, and they almost need to have the louder voice around like why can't, because they need to be able to consume it ultimately and be the advocates for it. And if you look at Stripe, you mentioned Stripe and Twilio before, they recognize that they need to cater for the
Mm.
developer first and that ease of consumption first. So yeah, getting that. So yeah, that's really interesting. Spending the time there, and the mocking is a great one. You don't have to do anything in production. You can even do it in a. I know a lot of organizations have got regulated environments or something. Something
Mm.
where they can't really, or they don't feel comfortable doing things in their environment. But you can easily do a mock with a subscription to one of these many tools and put that API
Mhm.
there, have those conversations. It's yeah, it's super interesting.
You mentioned something that I think is worth coming back to. You mentioned marketing and legal. That's another area where you can see this difference between internal and external oriented APIs.
Yeah,
Marketing
yeah, yeah,
internally is much less invested. Externally, though, when you have a product and especially if it's attention driven, you need marketing on board, and they're going to be concerned about brand, right? They're
yeah.
going to have a different perspective on this. Legal, also privacy, security. Like these are people who are going to be involved internally in a different way than they will be externally.
That's really, and it's interesting. We did an in-depth study of a lot of public APIs, and that
Mm,
one of the standout differentiators for ease of use is a sandbox with real data.
mm,
And then beyond that, some organizations that are, I'd say, really API driven, they will allow you to access real data within like 5 minutes. So you're in,
mhm.
and they'll stand up a production environment with dummy data for you to query as an engineer, or you can like use your own within 5 minutes. But that brings the legal thing in of, well, in some instances, if you're a bank, for instance, a lot of like giving someone a sandbox is one thing, but then giving them access to real data and production APIs, that the hurdle on that from an approval and process perspective is pretty high. Whereas for an
Yeah,
internal, yeah, well, you're saying for an internal, it's kind of like, well, everyone's already got all the approvals to see the data in theory, so let them have at it.
yeah. Again, and with banks, their reputation's on the line too. Like they want to make sure that they've set up a nice, safe space for the right things to happen to the customer and the end user customer. Um, but I think there's this interesting category, particularly in like regulated industries, where this data is stuff you really want to treat carefully. I'd say CRM is another one, but finance for sure, right? I'm going to need to run tests on my code to make sure that I didn't break something with my latest release. I don't want to have to wire you $1 million to see if my code still works for $1 million transfers, right? This
Yeah,
is exactly why I want to have access to a sandbox implementation.
yeah, yeah. And just going back to the use cases for a second, do you? I guess if you're doing it internally, I can see why, you were saying this trend of shifting away from just one to having your external and your internal. I guess where I'm going with it is, when you're thinking about your use case for your API, how far down the journey do you go? Do you go all the way to
Mm.
if I put my proper product discovery hat on, then we'd be doing some big customer journey maps. Like, what's the full life
Mm.
cycle? But with an
Mhm.
API, how far do you go down that? Internal, I can see.
Ah, so it's a great question. And again, I think you'll see the split between internal and external. Like there's a kind of over optimization that can happen if you're just trying to solve a problem that your team needs to unblock a particular journey for your own customer. You may be building an API to deal with that. If you have to stop and think about how are you going to productize this externally for all of your critical partners, that's a different kind of burden. And so I think what's been fascinating to me is this sort of digital transformation that's happened through APIs. Having these abstractions enables a kind of agility in terms of how you build and deliver software. That's magic. And so internally, you may choose to have, like, I would say it's an anti pattern if you have duplication of effort. If you have two people building two distinct services that could have been one, that's a problem. So having all of that information in one place so people can understand the work that others have done and leverage it rather than reinvent it, that's
Yeah,
huge. But there
yeah,
will be times where there are different reasons why you need a similar service.
yeah,
So knowing that that other service exists is important in understanding the trade-offs and your questions of where you're going to invest your effort. But it could be that say a notification service has to deal with a regulated sector that has different security and privacy needs. That might be a good reason to have a duplicate service.
yeah,
Maybe there's code you could repurpose from that. So more than anything, I think it's a use APIs internally to be more agile in how you deliver what it is your company exists to deliver. And then from that, think of those as raw materials. Now you can pick and choose to meet external use cases that may look a little different. How do you virtualize those services that map to actual code running somewhere in a way that a partner doesn't have to understand the layers of
and
technology that
yeah.
washed over you, that gave you what you have today, and can just think in terms of how do they solve their business problem with this abstraction that you're offering. So I'm not sure that I really answered your question. Like, how far do you take it? I think it
Uh,
depends on who your target audience is and how big you're aiming and what your overall goals are.
well, but that what I think you've kind of answered it for me in that, by thinking a bit more about this internal external split with APIs, you can then with the internal, it's almost giving permission to teams to not get caught up in the big, because once everyone gets caught up in the big thing, then all of a sudden you got a huge initiative, loads of teams, everyone's involved. There's all these sign-offs, and they never tend to work. Whereas they're like, no, no, we'll just focus on our specific problem. And yep, there's something similar over here, but let them do that too. We'll all
Mhm.
iterate on it. Maybe the services merge, maybe they don't. But then we've built the blocks to then when we do the external, it's an easier. It's not this bigger than Ben Hur kind of conversation. It's like, well, we got the little bits, and we're just going to stick them together. Oh, I can do that
Yeah,
next
and
week, kind of
yeah, and then
conversation.
smear on top a little bit of like
Bit of
culture
icing.
of building things. Yeah, well, yeah, but like these API standards, right?
Yeah,
If
yeah,
you
yeah.
understand sort of the patterns that work and translate well externally, you can use that to sort of shape these internal APIs so that it's easier to adapt in that way. You
Yep.
can do things if you're requiring all your teams to write an open API specification, you can run an analysis to understand sort of what language variation you have across your corpus of APIs, and you can use that to help inform and guide people to build APIs with
I think
better designs.
yeah, that's awesome. Marsh, thank you so much for your time today. We're running near the edge, but thanks so much. That was an awesome conversation around internal this shift to like thinking about internal external. Thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I think it's been fascinating to see how the industry has adapted over the last decade, and I think this sort of better understanding of internal versus external is one of the key things that we'll see playing out over the next few years. So thanks.
No worries. And for those listening, you can check out some of our other API series with Google. Thank you so much for joining us, and see you next time.